Hello and welcome to the channel. I am Johnny Boy, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Nvidia GeForce 6800 GS. This is the P&Y Verto overclocked model, and we're going to be pitting this card up against 6 games spanning from some earlier XP titles from the year 2003 all the way to some later titles from 2005. And we're going to be testing most of these games at their maximum settings from lower to higher resolutions, because my intention is to be able to use these results to compare to future results that I will gain from later GeForce and Radeon cards. So let's get to it. The GeForce 6800 GS debuted on the market on November 7th, 2005 to essentially replace the 6800 GT. The PCI Express model that we're looking at today uses a revision to the MV40 series of GPUs. And while the card at first glance simply seems like a cut down version of the 6800 GT when compared to its number of pixel shaders, vertex shaders, texture mapping units, and render output units, it makes up for that with significantly higher core clocks. Many times you will find this card nipping at the heels of the 6800 GT, and in some cases actually beating it. Now, the Verto model we're looking at today has 256 megabytes of GDDR3 with a core clock of 470 megahertz and a memory clock of 550 megahertz. As you can see, that is actually a pretty nice boost from the default configuration. The system I'll be using today is actually a computer that I built in 2011, as shown in these old blurry photographs. It's running on a Biostar AM3 motherboard with an AMD Phenom II 6-core 1100T. 4 2GB sticks totaling 8GB of DDR3 running at 1333 MHz, a 500GB Western Digital Blue hard drive, a Cooler Master High Airflow 912 case on Windows XP Service Pack 3. Now, the cooler taming this beast is a cheap little 2 heat pipe cooler that I found on eBay. This thing surprisingly keeps the temperatures at a comfortable level, and I might actually do a video on it in the future if y'all are interested. Okay, now it's time to get into the benchmarks.
Calculations are correct. When this baby hits 88 miles per hour, you're gonna see some serious shit.
So first up, we have Call of Duty from 2003. This is version 1.0, and we're benchmarking all the way from the beginning of the Pathfinder mission until you hit the next mission screen. It's only about 2.5 to 3 minutes long. The gameplay you are seeing is with the settings turned all the way up to the max at a resolution of 1280 by 1024. Now, this is the only game that I decided to test at one resolution, due to the extremely high average of 300 frames per second, with a low of only 125. This is a great example of how this card handles older XP titles without even breaking a sweat. Next up, we have Painkiller from 2004. Now, we're using version 1.61 as I could not get the game to even open with the version from the disk. And the benchmarking begins from the first level until you reach a temple and find your first armor pickup. It's about 2 minutes or so into the level. And the gameplay shown is at max settings at a resolution of 1920 by 1080. This game runs very well on this card. And as for the results, at 1024 by 768, we're seeing an average of 139 frames per second and a low of 81. The good performance continues at 1280 by 1024. We saw an average of 100 frames per second and a low of only 64. And finally, at 1920 by 1080, this card pumped out an average of 67 frames per second and a low of 43. The 6800 GS is very close to getting the coveted 60 frames per second minimum at this resolution, and with a couple of settings turned down, I'm sure it's attainable. The next game to enter the ring is Half-Life 2 originally released in 2004. However, the version that I am using is the most up-to-date version from Steam. The gameplay shown is at max settings with no motion blur at a resolution of 1024 by 768. The section used for benchmarking is the water hazard level. I started the test at the beginning of the level, ran it all the way until you reach the first loading screen. It's only about a 2.5 to 3 minute long run. At 1024 by 768, the game runs with an average of 63 FPS and a questionably low frame rate of 17. At 1280 by 1024, the card manages to deliver an average of 39 frames per second and a low of 10. Finally, at 1920 by 1080, the 1600GS struggles with an average of 28 and a low of 8. While these results aren't the greatest, it's honestly better than I expected since this is a very different version than the 2004 release. Next up, we have my favorite World War II shooter from 2005, Call of Duty 2. The version used was version 1.0 and the level used for benchmarking was Demolition. I started the test from the beginning of the mission until you reach the beginning of a trench and a Russian soldier is waiting for you there, and it's only about 2.5 minutes into the mission. The resolution shown is 1024 by 768, and at this resolution we can already see that this is going to be a hard game for this card to run, with an average of 34 frames per second and a low of 21. At 1280 by 1024, the game chugged along at an average of 25 frames per second and a low of 17. Finally, at 1920 by 1080, the slideshow was at an average of 17 frames per second and a low of 9. You would seriously need to lower some settings to attain a solid frame rate in this game. Alright, so Quake 4 is the next game up for testing. The version used is actually version 1.0, and the section used for benchmarking is from an early portion of the game when you are first handed the shotgun. I ran the test from there until you reach an elevator about 2 minutes later. The gameplay is at max settings with 2x anti-aliasing at a resolution of 1024 by 768. With this, the card comes up with a respectable average of 54 frames per second and a low of 32. At 1280 by 1024, we saw an average of 41 FPS and a low of 21. So with some settings, especially the anti-aliasing turned down, this game would gain easily playable frame rates. Unfortunately, I ran into issues running the game at higher resolutions. Version 1.0 doesn't seem to have a 1920 by 1080 option, and when I tried updating the game, I ran into constant slowdown issues, and these are issues that I had with an 8800 GTX, so it could be a driver issue. I also tried running the game at 1600 by 1200, but the game didn't seem to want to let me do that either. The last game to enter the fight is f.e.a.r, a must-play shooter from 2005. The version used was 1.8.282.0 from the gold edition of the game. I used the in-game benchmark for this one with the settings completely maxed out. At a resolution of 1024 by 768, the card managed an average of 45 frames per second and a low of 23. At 1280 by 1024, the test ran with an average of 30 frames per second and a low of 16. With the resolution turned up to 1920 by 1080, the benchmark turned into a slideshow with an average of 18 and a low of 11. This was quite a demanding game when it released, and this card didn't handle it too well. Alright, well, I guess that about wraps up this video. Thanks for watching, and oh wait, hold on a minute. Y'all didn't actually think I would end this video without answering the ultimate question. Will it run Crysis? Oh yeah. So, upon looking at the box to try to find the minimum system requirements, I was greeted with nothing. No system requirements to be found anywhere. Was Crytek afraid to list the system requirements on the box? So anyway, I consulted the manual to find this tiny little section simply stating to ensure your system meets the system requirements on the packaging. What a lie. Another interesting thing is the section found just below this about finding and ending background tasks. You know your game is hardcore if there's a section like that in the manual. Alright, okay, enough screwing around. How does it run the game? Well, yeah, it technically does run Crysis. But is it really Crysis when it's running at 800 by 600 and it looks like this? Anyway, the version I'm using is version 1.0, and the section used for benchmarking is when you reach the top of this hill in the first mission and the black bars appear until you hop in a Humvee that shows up when you go in guns blazing and drive up the road a little bit and reach 2 enemy soldiers. At 800 by 600 with the settings turned all the way down, the card managed an average of 57 and a low of 31. I mean, it's somewhat playable if you want to play at this garbage quality. At 1024 by 768, the numbers drop down to an average of 43 and a low of 24. I did test the game at 1280 by 1024 and 1920 by 1080, but y'all get the idea. The game turns into what reminds me of a video call over dial-up in the 90s. Horrible. Alright, so even though some of these benchmarks made the card look pretty bad, it actually did handle most of these games like a champ. The max settings and higher resolutions kinda gave it a bad representation, but I felt that these tests would work better to compare to the later cards. This was also my first time doing a video like this, or doing serious testing like this, so please leave suggestions down in the comments on what I did well and what I can work on. I'm also well aware that using Fraps isn't the best way to go about this, but I had issues using other programs like Afterburner. I also know that my camera sucks and my capture card is crap, but I do think it worked better than just filming the monitor. Alright, bye for now. Thanks for watching.